Three women had already run from this place screaming. Evelyn Mercer was about to become the fourth, except she didn't run. She stepped off that wagon, looked up at the scarred man standing in the canyon shadow, and made a decision that would drag an entire town through fire before it was over. What she found inside that crumbling house wasn't a monster. It was 12 years of grief stacked floor to ceiling in the shape of books. And a man who'd stopped believing anyone would ever stay long enough to understand why they mattered. She stayed, and that changed everything. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let me see how far this canyon carries. Montana, August 1883. The canyon swallowed the wagon road about 2 miles past the Harlow Creek crossing, and from that point forward, Evelyn Mercer had nothing to look at but walls of red rock climbing so high on either side that the sky shrank down to a pale blue ribbon overhead. The driver, an old man named Cutter who smelled of pipe tobacco and horse sweat, hadn't said a word to her in the last 4 miles. He'd said plenty before that, most of it warnings. 3 before you, he'd told her, back in Ridgeline when she was still loading her trunk onto the wagon bed. 3 women made that same trip. First one lasted 2 days. Second one, she didn't even get through the first night. Third one, young girl from Missouri. She walked out so fast she left her shoes behind. He'd paused to let that land. Left her shoes. Evelyn had looked at him with a kind of flat patience that seemed to confuse him. "Are you going to help me with this trunk or not?" she'd said. He helped with the trunk, but he hadn't talked much after that. Now the wagon creaked and jolted over stones that had no business being in a road, and Evelyn sat on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and studied the canyon walls. They were streaked red and ochre and a deep burnt orange where the afternoon light caught the rock face, and here and there she could see where water had carved channels through the stone over centuries, leaving long curved grooves that looked like the marks a giant hand might make, dragging its fingers slowly down. There were juniper trees clinging to ledges they had no business clinging to, a hawk circling far above the ribbon of sky. The air smelled different here, cooler, with something green underneath it, which surprised her. She'd expected dust and dead heat. This was not that. "How much farther?" she asked. Cutter grunted. "Quarter mile, maybe less." She smoothed her skirt. She had not eaten since early morning, and she had not slept properly in 3 days. And the man she was about to marry was a complete stranger whose name she had learned from a notice printed in a Helena newspaper 6 weeks ago. The notice had been businesslike to the point of coldness. Widower, 34 years. Own property, Canyon Settlement, Ridgeline County. Seeks capable woman for marriage and household. No prior acquaintance required. Write to G. Hale. She had written to G. Hale. G. Hale had written back. The letters were polite and brief and told her almost nothing personal except that he had once taught school and no longer did, and that the canyon got cold in October and there was a great deal to do before then. He had not mentioned love or loneliness or expectations. She had appreciated the honesty of that, in a strange way. Men who rode in circles around the truth made her tired. This one had just said what the situation was. She was 26 years old. Her father was dead. Her older brother had a family of his own and a small farm that barely supported them, and Evelyn had been living in that house for 2 years, in the particular kind of silence that settles over people who are too polite to say out loud that the arrangement is not working. She wasn't desperate. She wanted to be clear about that, even if only to herself. She was practical. There was a difference. The wagon rounded a bend and she saw the house. It sat at the far end of a widened section of the canyon where the walls pulled back enough to allow a patch of flat ground maybe 2 acres across. There was a creek running along the north edge, narrow and bright. There was a lean-to shelter with a mule underneath it and a woodpile, and a dead kitchen garden that had been neglected so long the weeds had taken over completely. And there was the house itself, 2 stories built from the canyon's own stone and timber, bigger than she'd expected, with a porch running the full length of the front and windows on both floors. Some of the windows were open. One of the second-floor shutters hung at an angle like a broken wing. Standing on the porch was a man. He was taller than she'd imagined, wide through the shoulders. He had dark hair gone gray at the temples and a beard that wasn't quite kept. and he held a book in one hand with his thumb marking the page, which she found interesting, that he'd been reading when he heard the wagon coming and had walked outside without putting the book down. He was watching the wagon approach with an expression she couldn't read at this distance. Not welcoming, not hostile. More like a man watching weather roll in and trying to calculate what it might do. She could see the scar from 50 yards out. It ran from just below his left ear down the side of his jaw and disappeared into his beard. Old and settled, the kind of scar that had long since stopped hurting but never quite disappeared into the surrounding skin. She had been told about it in town. The telling had been meant to unsettle her. She filed it away the same as she'd filed away the warnings about the 3 women who'd left. Cutter pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch and climbed down with the creaking effort of an old man's joints. Evelyn climbed down herself before he could come around to help her, which she could tell mildly irritated him. She stood in the canyon dust and looked up at Gideon Hale, and Gideon Hale looked down at her. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, careful with words, like a man who'd trained himself not to spend them carelessly. "Mr. Hale," she said, a pause that went on probably 2 seconds longer than was comfortable. "You're taller than I thought," he said. It seemed to come out before he decided to say it, and something shifted in his face immediately after, a slight tightening, like he wished he could pull the words back. "You're grimmer than I thought," she said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. Something moved through his expression that might, in different light, have been almost a smile. It didn't quite make it. "I can take your trunk." "Thank you." He came down off the porch, and she noticed he moved carefully, not stiffly, but with the deliberateness of a man who'd learned not to rush things. He lifted the trunk from the wagon bed without asking Cutter for help, and carried it up the porch steps and inside. Cutter took his payment from Evelyn's hand without looking at her, turned the wagon around with considerable effort, and started back the way they'd come. She stood alone in the canyon yard and listened to the sound of the wagon wheels fading until it was gone, and there was nothing left but the creek and the wind moving through the junipers somewhere up on the canyon wall. She looked around the yard, the dead kitchen garden, the broken shutter, a split-rail fence that had mostly fallen over, a rusted water trough. The whole place had the look of something that had once been tended, and then, at some specific point in time, had stopped being tended. Not through laziness. More like the man living here had one day simply stopped seeing the point. She went inside. Shum. The house was not what she expected. She'd stepped through the front door into a room that was part entry hall, part chaos. There were stacks of books on every flat surface, not piled carelessly. She could see there was order to it, some kind of system, books grouped by size or by topic or by something she couldn't immediately identify. But the sheer volume of them was staggering. Floor-to-ceiling shelving had been built along 2 full walls of what should have been the front parlor, and every shelf was packed 2 rows deep. More stacks rose from the floor in columns, waist-high and higher. There were books on the stairs, books on the windowsills, an entire crate of them just inside the door, as if recently arrived and not yet integrated into whatever system governed the rest. It smelled like paper and dust and something underneath that, wood smoke, maybe, or the stone of the canyon walls itself. Gideon was setting her trunk at the foot of the stairs. He straightened and seemed to become aware all at once of her standing in the middle of the room looking at the books. His jaw tightened slightly. The look of a man waiting for judgment. "There are more upstairs," he said. His voice was neutral, but she could hear the tension underneath it, braced for something. "How many?" she asked. He thought about it. "I've never counted precisely, somewhere between 800 and 1,000, I expect." He paused. "I know it's... Where did they all come from?" He blinked. That wasn't what he'd been expecting her to say. "Some I brought west with me. The rest I've acquired over years. Traders, estate sales, the occasional post shipment." He paused again. "It's a great deal of space they take." "Yes," she agreed. She walked to the nearest shelf and looked at the spines. Principles of Geology, the complete works of Shakespeare, Huxley's Man's Place in Nature, Elements of Chemistry, A History of the Roman Empire. She pulled one out, a battered copy of David Copperfield, the cover soft with handling, turned it over in her hands and set it back. "Did you read all of them?" "Most." A beat. "Some more than once?" She turned around and looked at him straight. "Mr. Hale, I want to be direct with you, if that's acceptable." A cautious nod. "I'm not easily frightened. I'm not looking for a fairy story. I know what the arrangement is, and I came here with clear eyes. Whatever happened to make you leave the East, I don't need you to tell me today or next week or ever, if you choose not to. But I need you to understand I'm not here to run." She looked at him steadily. "I'm here to work. I'd like us to figure out how to do that together without making each other miserable. Can you manage that?" The silence ran long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged him entirely. His expression had gone through something she couldn't follow. Complicated, several things at once, like weather changing too fast. "I expect I can try," he said at last. "Good," she said. "Now, is there food in this house? I haven't eaten since Billings." There was food of a kind. He had dried meat and a half sack of cornmeal and some withered root vegetables he'd clearly forgotten about, and she found a jar of preserved peaches in the back of a cabinet that turned out to be the best thing she'd ever tasted after 3 days on the trail. She cooked while he stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his arms crossed and the book still in his hand, not quite watching her, but not quite not watching her either. "You don't have to stand there," she told him. "I'm not in the way." "No, you're just hovering." She stirred the cornmeal without looking at him. "Sit down if you're going to stay in here." He sat. The kitchen was in better shape than the rest of the house, cleaner, more used. There was a decent iron stove and a proper chimney and a work table scarred with years of use. Outside the kitchen window, the canyon wall rose close enough that she could have thrown a stone and hit it, and in the last of the afternoon light, it glowed a deep red that came through the glass and lay across the floor like something spilled. "The Reverend in Ridgeline," he said after a while. "Reverend Marsh," she said. "I met him when I arrived. He'll do the ceremony day after tomorrow, if that suits you. He comes through the canyon on his circuit." A pause. "If you still want to proceed." She glanced at him over her shoulder. He was looking at the table, not at her. "I said I wasn't here to run," she said. "People change their minds." "I'm aware. I haven't." She turned back to the stove. "Day after tomorrow is fine." He didn't say anything else for a while. She could hear the creek outside, and somewhere distant, what might have been a coyote. The cornmeal began to thicken. "I should tell you," he said, "that I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not easy to live with." "I didn't think you would be. I mean, I don't—" Another stop. He pressed the heel of his hand against the table's edge, a small, frustrated movement. "I don't know how to talk to people the way they want to be talked to. I've been alone here for a long time, and I've—" He trailed off. "Gotten out of practice," she offered. He looked up. "Something like that." "Well," she said, "I'm not looking for someone who knows all the right things to say. I'm looking for someone honest enough to say the wrong things." She set the spoon down and looked at him across the kitchen. "You've managed 2 of those already tonight. That's a reasonable start." He looked at her with that same complicated expression she'd caught before, too much in it to read easily. And then he looked back down at the table, and something in his shoulders, she noticed, dropped very slightly. Not much. Just a fraction. But it was there. She slept in the upstairs room he'd cleared for her, which had a window that faced east and a narrow iron bed and more books. She counted 4 stacks she had to navigate around just to reach the bed. She'd fallen asleep almost immediately, which was something of a mercy. In the morning, she woke to a canyon already full of amber light, and she lay still for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the place. The creek, wind in the junipers up on the canyon rim, somewhere below, the mule shifting in its shelter, and underneath all of it, a silence that wasn't quite like any silence she'd known before, thick with stone and space, a silence that had been accumulating here for a long time. She got up and washed her face from the basin and went downstairs. Gideon was already in the front room, standing at the shelf closest to the window with his back to the stairs, a book open in his hands. He hadn't heard her come down, or if he hadn't turned around. She watched him for a moment. He was running his finger slowly along a line of text, the way a person does when they're not just reading but thinking, working something out. She noticed again how still he held himself, a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She went to the kitchen and started the fire. A few minutes later, she heard his footsteps behind her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Someone has to." She opened the stove door and adjusted the wood. You had coffee? I have chicory. That'll do. He got the chicory down from the shelf and handed it to her, and she noticed his hands. They were large and a little battered, the knuckles of his right hand scarred in a pattern she didn't want to speculate about yet. But they were also, she noticed this because it surprised her, careful hands. The way he held things. The way he set the chicory tin on the counter next to her instead of putting it down carelessly. She filed that away. There's a lot of work needed on the property, she said, as she measured chicory into the pot. The kitchen garden is dead, but the soil looked decent when I walked through it. We might still get some fall planting in if we work quickly, and the fence on the south side is down completely. I know. When did it come down? A pause. Sometime last spring. I didn't get to it. She turned the water out of the pitcher into the pot and set it on the stove. There's a lot you didn't get to. No, he said. Not defensive, just accurate. All right, she said, we'll make a list. He looked at her. A list? Of what needs doing, in order of urgency. She sat down at the table and found a stub of pencil in her apron pocket and smoothed a piece of paper on the table in front of her. Kitchen garden, fence, the shutter on the north window upstairs, the water trough. What else? He stood for a moment with the look of a man who had genuinely not thought about these things in so long that naming them felt strange. Then, slowly, he came and sat across the table from her. The roof over the lean-to, he said. It needs patching before fall. And there's a section of the creek bank that keeps washing out after rain, blocks the drainage into the yard. She wrote it down. What else? He thought for a moment longer. The chimney in the east room. I've been afraid to use the fireplace in there because I'm not certain the flue is clear. All right, she kept writing. We'll have someone look at it. There isn't... He stopped. There isn't really anyone who comes out here usually. I do for myself. Then we'll figure it out ourselves. She finished writing and looked at the list, then back at him. This is manageable. None of this is impossible. He was watching her with an expression that was hard to name. Not quite confused, not quite something else. Like a man watching something happen that he'd half convinced himself wasn't going to happen. You're very organized, he said. My mother was organized. I got it from her. She folded the paper. I'm also stubborn. I got that from my father. Fair warning. He was quiet a moment. I'm stubborn too. I know, she said. I could tell. For the second time, something moved through his face that might have been the distant precursor to a smile. It still didn't fully arrive, but it was getting closer. They married 2 days later in the yard in front of the house, with Reverend Marsh, a skinny man with a large hat who seemed faintly bewildered by the proceedings, presiding over a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes. Gideon wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. Evelyn wore the dress she'd kept pressed in her trunk all the way from Billings. There were no witnesses except the mule, who showed no particular interest. When Reverend Marsh said the words that needed to be said and looked at them expectantly, Gideon turned to Evelyn with a formal stiffness that she suspected was nerves rather than coldness, and said, quietly and precisely, I'll do right by you. I want that to be clear. I know, she said. I'll do the same. The Reverend declared them married and looked around as though hoping someone might produce refreshments. No one did. He shook Gideon's hand, tipped his hat to Evelyn, and climbed back on his horse. They watched him ride down the canyon road in silence. Well, Evelyn said. Yes, Gideon said. They went back inside. The house came into focus for her slowly, the way things do when you're too busy to study them and can only catch them in passing. She learned that Gideon woke before dawn, every morning, without exception, and went directly to the books. Not always the same books. She began to notice a pattern in which volumes migrated from the shelves to the table to his chair to back to the shelves. He read the way some men drank, with a concentration that shut out everything else. Twice in the first week she said his name directly and he didn't respond, not from rudeness but from genuine absence. He was somewhere else entirely, between the lines of whatever he was holding. She learned that he cooked badly, but tried, and that on the evening she was too tired to manage supper, he would produce something scorched and peculiar and set it on the table with an expression that dared her to complain about it, which she never did. She learned that he avoided Ridgeline. She'd heard this in town before she came out. People said he came in once a month for supplies and otherwise kept to himself. But seeing it up close was different from hearing about it. When she needed to ride in for flour and seed corn at the end of the first week, she asked if he wanted to come. He said he had things to attend to at the house. His voice went flat and careful when he said it, the way it did when he was shutting something down. She went alone. Ridgeline was a raw sort of town. A main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a land office, a small white church. Maybe 300 people in the town proper, more spread across the surrounding ranches. The woman at the general store was a broad-shouldered woman named Doris Phelps, who clearly knew exactly who Evelyn was and sized her up from behind the counter with the kind of frank appraisal that small towns permit. "So you stayed," Doris said. "I stayed," Evelyn said. Doris considered this. The last one, Mabel from Missouri, she said the house was haunted, that something was wrong with the air in it. She began weighing out flour without being asked. Clara Brent, the one before, she said he barely spoke to her for 48 hours, and then one morning she woke up and just couldn't take it anymore. A pause. "What do you make of him?" "He's not haunted," Evelyn said. "He's lonely. There's a difference." Doris looked at her with something that might have been approval. "You want to know what people say about why he came here? I want to know what's true. Do you know the difference?" A short laugh. "More than most." She handed Evelyn her flower. "What I know for certain is that he came here about 12 years back with a wagon full of books and enough money to buy that canyon property outright. He'd been a school teacher somewhere back east, Pennsylvania, I think. Whatever happened back there, nobody agrees on what it was. His name is Mud in some circles, and in other circles nobody's heard of him at all." She leaned on the counter. "He taught the Carver children for about 6 months, a few years after he arrived, free of charge, out at the canyon. Then the family moved on, and that was the end of it. Since then, he just—" She tilted her head. "Just keeps to himself with those books." Evelyn thought about him standing in the front room in the gray early light, his finger moving along the line of text. "He was a good teacher," she said. Not a question. "By all accounts," Doris said. "The Carver kids could all read by the time their family left. The youngest was 4 years old." A pause. "That's something." Evelyn loaded her supplies into the wagon. On the way back through the canyon, she thought about what Doris had said, about the 6 months he'd taught, and then the stopping. She thought about what a man does with all that knowledge when there's no one to give it to. On the 8th day, she found the east wing. She hadn't explored the full house yet. There had been too much to do outside, and inside she'd focused on the kitchen and her own room and the front parlor. But on the 8th morning, she pushed open a door at the end of the upstairs hall she'd assumed was a storage room and found instead a long empty space that ran the full width of the house's east side. It had been a schoolroom once. She could see it clearly. The proportions of it, long and rectangular, with windows spaced evenly along the south wall, nail holes in the wall where a blackboard had been mounted, marks on the floor where benches had stood, a hook by the door where a teacher's coat might have hung. It was empty now, dusty and abandoned, and there was something about the emptiness of it that was different from the rest of the house, heavier, more specific. She stood in the middle of it for a long time. Then she went and found Gideon in the yard, where he was resetting the fallen fence rail they'd agreed was first priority, working with more care and less efficiency than was probably necessary because he was thinking about something else. She could always tell when he was thinking about something else. His hands kept going, but his eyes got that distant look. "What was the east wing?" she asked. He drove the fence post he was holding into the ground with rather more force than needed. His back was to her. "Storage," he said. "No," she said. "It was a classroom." "What happened to it?" A long pause. He picked up the next fence rail and set it without turning around. "I stopped using it." "Why?" Another pause. "There was no one to teach." She waited. He wasn't finished. She could sense it. There was more packed into those 6 words than they could hold, and he knew it too. There was— He stopped, set down the fence rail and stood with both hands resting on the top of the post, looking at the canyon wall. There were children here, a few families settled in the canyon and the surrounding area, about 6 years back. We had— I taught their children for close to a year, reading, arithmetic, some history. He paused. It was the best year I'd had since leaving Pennsylvania. He said it with a flatness that made it worse, not better. Then the settlement dried up, drought and a bad winter back to back. Most families left, the children left with them, and he picked the fence rail back up. I closed the room, and never reopened it, She looked at the canyon wall. A hawk was up there again, or maybe the same one. She'd begun to suspect there was only one hawk and that it kept watch over all of them. There are still children in the settlement, she said. I saw them in Ridgeline. I talked to some of the mothers at the store. There are families out on the ranches whose children have never held a book. She paused. There are families inside this canyon. He said nothing. The room is there, she said. The books are there. She kept her voice even, matter of fact. You're here. I'm here. He turned around then, looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one he got when he was fighting something. It's not that simple, he said. It never is, she said. Does that mean we shouldn't try? He looked at her for a long time. The hawk turned a wide, slow circle above them both. The creek ran its line of silver along the north edge of the yard. You don't know what you're asking, he said. You don't know what happened in Pennsylvania. No, she agreed, but whatever it was 12 years ago. And you've got a room full of books and a classroom going to dust and children in this valley who can't read their own names. She held his gaze. I don't think you need to tell me what happened back there for us to agree that none of that is right. He looked away first. Back to the fence. He picked up the post hammer and drove the rail home with 3 solid blows. The benches are gone, he said. His voice had changed. Something let out of it, like a pressure equalizing. We'd have to build them. Then we'll build them, she said. He drove another nail. Didn't say anything, but she noticed his jaw, which had been set like stone since she'd asked the first question, had eased. Just slightly. Just enough. She went back inside and found a piece of paper and began, in her careful handwriting, to make another list. Mama said. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, they sat together after supper, not because there was something to discuss, but simply because the evening was too warm for the fire, and the front room had a through breeze that made it pleasant, and there was nowhere else in particular they needed to be. Gideon had his book. She had her mending. The lamp on the table between them made a small yellow circle in the dark. After a while, she said, without looking up from the mending, what was the last book that made you feel something? Not intellectually, something. He didn't answer immediately. She didn't rush him. Bleak House, he said finally. Dickens. The part near the end where... He stopped. It wouldn't mean anything if you haven't read it. I have read it. He looked up. You have? My father had a library. Modest, but decent. I read everything in it twice. She bit off a thread. Which part near the end? He was quiet for a moment, looking at nothing. When Esther understands that all the years of waiting and not knowing what she was owed, all of it finally made sense, not because she was rewarded for her patience, but because she'd chosen, over and over, to stay present, even when it cost her. He paused. That passage. The first time I read it, I had to put the book down and go outside. She stopped mending, looked at him across the lamp. Yes, she said quietly. That's the one. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the complicated, tangled expression, not the braced against judgment look. Just something open, unguarded. There and gone in a second, like a door blown open by wind and then pushed shut again. He looked back at his book. She looked back at her mending. But the room felt different after that, like something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just 1 degree. Enough to notice if you were paying attention. She was paying attention. Outside, the canyon held its dark and its silence, and the creek ran on the way it always had, and up on the rim somewhere a coyote called once and went quiet. Inside the lamp made its small circle of yellow light, and in it 2 people sat who had been strangers 3 weeks ago and were something else now. Not yet sure what, but definitely something else. She folded her mending and set it aside. We'll start on the benches tomorrow, she said. He turned a page. Yes, he said. All right. The benches took 4 days. Gideon had timber stored under the lean-to from a cutting he'd done 2 years back and never used for anything, and Evelyn found his tools in reasonable condition. He took care of things he valued, she'd noticed, and tools apparently made the list even when fences and water troughs didn't. They worked in the mornings while the canyon was still cool, Gideon measuring and cutting while Evelyn sanded the raw edges down with a piece of rough stone until her palms were red and her shoulders ached in ways she hadn't expected. She didn't complain. Neither did he. On the second morning, he came outside and found her already at it, working on a plank he'd cut the evening before, and he stood there for a moment with 2 cups of chicory watching her work. "You don't have to do that part," he said. "I know." She didn't look up. He set 1 cup next to her on the sawhorse and took a long drink from his own and watched the canyon wall for a while. A strip of early light was moving down the red rock from the east rim, slow and warm. "The edges need to be smooth," he said. "Splinters." "I know," she said again. "That's why I'm doing it." He looked at the plank she was working on, then at the 3 others she'd already finished, stacked neatly to the side. He went to pick one up and ran his thumb along the edge, checking. It was smooth. Better than smooth. Careful work, done right. He set it back down without saying anything and went to pick up his saw. That was the closest thing to a compliment she'd gotten from him so far, and she found, to her slight surprise, that it was enough. By the end of the 4th day, they had 4 benches, 2 of them long enough to seat 3 children apiece, 2 shorter ones for the little ones. They carried them upstairs to the east room one at a time, Gideon taking the heavier end without discussion, and arranged them in 2 rows facing the wall where the blackboard had once hung. The nail holes stared back at them from the plaster. "We'll need a board," Evelyn said. "There's a sheet of pressed tin in the lean-to. I can coat it with lamp black and it'll do the same job." "All right." She walked to the front of the room and turned around and looked at the benches. 4 benches in a dusty room with empty nail holes in the wall and afternoon light coming through south-facing windows. It was not much. It was something. "How many children do you think we can get?" she asked. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "I don't know. It depends on the families." He said it carefully. "Some of them. I'm not the most welcome face in this settlement. You should know that before you start knocking on doors." "I know." She'd heard enough in Ridgeline to know what she was walking into. She crossed to the window and looked out at the canyon yard below. "I'll knock the doors. You worry about what we're going to teach when they show up." "If they show up." She turned around. "When?" she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, something unreadable moving through his expression. Then he uncrossed his arms and pushed off the doorframe. "I'll start on the tin board tonight," he said. She turned back to the window. Below, the yard sat quiet in the late afternoon gold, the creek running silver at the edge, the canyon walls holding everything inside their red arms. She thought about the children Doris Phelps had described in Ridgeline, the Tanner family out on the East Branch, 5 kids, none of them schooled, the Adler widow with her 3, the Burr family, ranchers a mile up the canyon, 4 boys who ran half wild because their father worked from dark to dark and their mother had died 2 winters back. She thought about a boy who couldn't write his own name and what that cost him. She thought about it the way you think about something that matters, quietly and without drama, turning it over and setting it down and picking it up again. She went downstairs and wrote letters, 7 letters in total, to 7 families in and around the canyon settlement, written in her clearest hand on paper she'd brought from Billings and had been rationing carefully. She said the same basic thing in each, though the words shifted to fit what she knew about each family, that there was to be a school, free of charge, at the Canyon House. That children of any age were welcome, that no materials were needed, paper and chalk and books would be provided, that lessons would run 3 mornings a week so as not to interfere with chores and ranch work, and that they were welcome to come see the room for themselves before they decided. She gave the letters to the Ridgeline supply rider the next morning and waited. The first response came back 4 days later. It was from Martha Burr, the rancher's wife who had died. Her eldest son, Thomas, 17 years old and functionally illiterate, had written the response himself, badly but determinedly, 3 lines saying that his younger brothers would come on the agreed morning and that he would bring them himself because he didn't trust them to come alone. There was a postscript in different handwriting, a neighbor who'd helped him with the spelling, she guessed. that said Thomas himself would like to come if that was permitted. She brought the letter to Gideon at the table that evening. He read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read the postscript again. "He's 17, he said. "I know. The other students will be 8, 9 years old. I know that too." She sat down across from him. "Does that matter?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it doesn't matter." By the morning of the first class, she had confirmed 6 families. 11 children, ranging from a girl of 5 whose mother had written back with visible desperation, "She has no one to play with and nothing to do, and I am at my wit's end," to Thomas Burr, who arrived first 20 minutes early, with his 3 younger brothers in tow and a look on his face that dared anyone to say something about his being there. Evelyn met them at the door. "Thomas," she said, "come in. You can sit wherever you like." He looked past her into the front room, taking in the books the way everyone did the first time, that moment of sheer volume landing on you like a wave. His expression shifted through several things quickly. "He's got all these?" he said, not hostile, something closer to disbelief. "He does. You can borrow any of them once you've learned enough to manage them." Thomas looked at her. He was tall for his age, raw-boned and weathered, with work-hardened hands and wary eyes. He'd never been in a place like this. She could see that plainly. "I won't be the slowest one in there," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a condition. "No promises," she said. "But I'd bet against it." He held her gaze for another second, then nodded once and walked inside, herding his brothers ahead of him. By the time the other families arrived, the Tanner children in a clattering group, the Adler widows 3, a pair of siblings from a family she hadn't written to who had simply heard and shown up, the upstairs East Room was fuller than it had been in years. 11 children on 4 benches, and Thomas Burr standing in the back because he was too tall and too proud to squeeze onto a bench with 7-year-olds, and Evelyn standing at the front, and Gideon standing in the doorway. He'd gone still when he saw the room full. She caught it in her peripheral vision, that arrested, held-breath stillness, like a man walking into something he'd been bracing for that turned out to be different than he'd prepared for. She gave him a moment and then looked at him directly. He walked to the front of the room. He stood there, and all the children looked at him, this tall, scarred, serious man with the lamp-black tin board behind him and the canyon light coming through the south windows. And the room went very quiet. "My name is Hale," he said. "We are going to learn to read. If you already know how to read, we are going to read better. If you don't know your letters yet, we'll start there." He looked across the room at all of them, slowly. No one is behind. No one is ahead. We start from where we are. He picked up the chalk. A 5-year-old girl in the front row, the one whose mother was at her wit's end, sat up very straight and watched him with the absolute total attention that small children are capable of when something catches them exactly right. He wrote the letter A on the tin board, and that was the beginning. Those first weeks were harder than Evelyn had expected, not because of the children, but because of what teaching them surfaced in Gideon. She watched it happen day by day, lesson by lesson, the way it cracked something open in him that had been sealed shut for years. Some mornings he was sharp and careful and precise, moving through the room from child to child with a patience she hadn't seen him apply to much else, correcting and encouraging in equal measure. Other mornings he came downstairs with a closed-off look that told her something had broken through the night before, and he hadn't been able to put it away again. On one of those mornings, she found him standing at the East Room window before the children arrived, not looking at his books, but out at the canyon, the look of a man standing at the edge of something. "You don't have to tell me," she said from the doorway, "but you're going to have 12 children in here in 40 minutes, and I need to know if you're all right." He didn't turn around. "In Pennsylvania," he said. His voice was flat and careful. "There was a school. I taught there for 9 years. He stopped. "I was good at it, better than most. And I had—" Another stop. "I had a colleague, another teacher, a man I'd known since we were both in university. He was angry about something. A position he'd been passed over for, I think, something like that. And he went to the board and told them I'd misappropriated school funds, kept a portion of the community donations for myself." The words came out steady and spaced, the way words do when you've been holding them so long they've worn smooth. It wasn't true. None of it was true. But there were enough people willing to believe it, and I had no... He pressed his fingers against the windowsill. I had no one who stood up, not one person. In 9 years I had taught their children. He stopped again, and this time it was longer. And not one person stood up. Evelyn didn't say anything. So I left, he said, because what else was there? And I came here because there was land and no one knew my name, and I thought, a small exhausted sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I thought I was done with all of it, with hoping that anything I built would hold. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, not touching, just there. Thomas Burr wrote his name yesterday, she said after a moment. Did you see his face? A long silence. Yes, he said. He's going to be able to write a deed of sale before winter. He's going to be able to read a contract. His father's been cheated twice by men who counted on him not being able to do either of those things. Gideon said nothing. Whatever happened in Pennsylvania, she said, it happened to you. Not to Thomas Burr. Not to the Tanner children. Not to that little girl in the front row who already knows all her letters and is going to run out of things to learn at this rate. She paused. I know that's not a simple thing to sit with. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying the room is going to be full in 40 minutes. He turned from the window. His jaw was set again, but it was set differently than it had been when she first arrived. Not like a man shutting down, but like a man holding himself together while he decided what to do next. I know, he said, and then quieter. Thank you. She didn't make a thing of it. She went downstairs to start the morning fire, and 40 minutes later the children arrived, and Gideon was at the front of the room with chalk in his hand. And if there was something raw and careful about him that morning, the children didn't seem to mind. Thomas Burr, in his spot at the back of the room, was already working on the page she'd given him the day before, his tongue pressed against his back teeth in concentration, writing his name over and over and over until it looked the way he wanted it to look. It was in the third week that Evelyn first heard the name Harlow Vance. She heard it from Martha Adler, the widow, who stopped her after class one morning while the children were still filing out. Martha Adler was a thin woman in her 40s with a permanent wary look that Evelyn recognized as the look of someone who had learned to see trouble coming from a long way off. I need to tell you something, Martha said. She spoke quietly, with one eye on the door. There are men in town, railroad men. They've been surveying the canyon. Evelyn kept her expression even. Surveying it for what? A route. They want to run a line through here, from Billings south. And the man they work for, Harlow Vance, he's out of Chicago. He's already been talking to some of the ranchers. Martha pressed her lips together. Talking about what the land would be worth. Talking about how a railroad means trade, means markets, means the settlement finally being worth something. And, Evelyn said, because there was clearly more. And he's been asking questions about Hale, about who owns the canyon property, how long he's been here, whether the title is solid. Martha looked at her steadily. I don't know what he knows, but the way he's asking, it's not idle curiosity. After the children had gone and the house was quiet again, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chicory gone cold and thought about what Martha had said. The canyon walls outside the window were in afternoon shadow now, the red gone out of them. They looked heavier in shadow, more like walls. She thought about the room upstairs, benches built with 4 days of morning work, tin board coated in lamp black, chalk marks still on it from this morning's lesson. The 5-year-old girl who now knew all her letters. Thomas Burr, and his name written over and over until it held. She thought about the look on Gideon's face when the room was full for the first time. She heard him come in the back door, the particular sound of his boots on the kitchen floor. He came to the doorway, saw her sitting there, looked at the cold cup, then at her face. What is it? He said. She looked up at him. Sit down, she said. There's something I need to tell you. Gideon took the news the way Evelyn had come to expect him to take hard things, without visible reaction at first, just that settling stillness, like a man standing in cold water and deciding whether to move. He sat across the table from her while she told him what Martha Adler had said, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Harlow Vance, he said finally. You know the name? I know the company. He turned his cup in his hands. Continental Rail. They've been moving west for 3 years. I read about it in a paper someone left at the general store last spring. He set the cup down. They don't negotiate. They find what they want and they push until they get it, or until whoever's in the way runs out of reasons to stay. Evelyn watched him. And my title is solid. I bought this land outright in 1871. I have the deed registered at the Ridgeline Land Office. He paused. But if they want to make trouble, the deed won't be enough. A land company with money and lawyers can find all kinds of ways to make a solid title feel uncertain. Then we need to know what they're planning before they move, she said. He looked at her across the table. Evelyn, if they find out about Pennsylvania, we don't know what they know yet. That's not the point. If they dig into my history and bring it here, into this settlement, in front of these families. He stopped, pressed his thumb against a groove in the table. The school is new. These families don't know me. They came because you convinced them to come. If Vance's people start spreading what happened in Pennsylvania, whether it's true or not, these families will pull their children and they won't look back. Maybe, Evelyn said. Not maybe. She held his gaze. I know it's a risk. I'm asking you what you want to do about it, not whether it's a risk. He looked out the window at the dark canyon for a moment. When he turned back, his expression was tired in a specific way, not defeated, but worn through to something underneath the surface defenses, like rock worn down to what was always there beneath. I don't know, he said, which was, she'd come to understand, the most honest thing he knew how to say. She left it there for the night. There was nothing else to do with it yet. 2 mornings later, Harlow Vance came to the canyon. She heard the horses first, more than one, coming down the canyon road with the particular unhurried confidence of men who expected the world to wait for them. She was in the kitchen when she heard them, and she went to the window and saw 2 men riding into the yard, one on a gray horse, broad-shouldered and heavy in the saddle, wearing a coat too fine for Montana dust. The other smaller, younger, carrying a leather satchel across his lap like a clerk. Gideon came in from the back of the house. He'd been at the woodpile, and stopped when he saw her expression. They're here, she said. He set the axe against the wall. He went to the door and opened it before they had a chance to knock, which she could tell through the broad-shouldered man fractionally off his prepared approach. He stepped down from his horse with the careful ease of someone used to making entrances, and he looked at Gideon the way men like him looked at men like Gideon, measuring, categorizing, deciding in the first 5 seconds how much resistance to anticipate. Mr. Hale, his voice was smooth and deliberate. My name is Harlow Vance. I represent Continental Rail. He extended his hand. Gideon shook it because there was nothing to be gained by not shaking it. Mr. Vance, I wonder if we might have a conversation. Vance's eyes moved past Gideon into the house briefly, then back. About the property. Come in, Gideon said. Evelyn had the table cleared and was standing near the kitchen door when they came inside. Vance noticed the books the same way everyone did, but his reaction was different. Not wonder or curiosity, but a fast, assessing flicker, like a man pricing an estate. His clerk positioned himself near the door with his satchel open across his knees. Quite a collection, Vance said, looking at the shelves. Sit down, Gideon said. Vance sat. He had a way of settling into a chair that communicated ownership of whatever space he occupied. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Gideon directly. I'll be straightforward with you, he said. Continental Rail is planning a southern spur from Billings. The most direct and practical route runs through this canyon. Your property sits at the midpoint of that route. He paused to let that land. We're prepared to make a very fair offer for the land. Better than fair, honestly. The company values goodwill with property holders, and we're prepared to reflect that in the price. Gideon said nothing. Vance continued in the same measured voice. I understand you've lived here for some years. I understand there's a school operating here now. A slight pause on the word school, barely perceptible, but there. Naturally, if you were to sell, we could factor in relocation costs. Time to... This land isn't for sale, Gideon said. A beat of silence. Vance smiled. It was a practice smile, one that had smoothed over a great many obstacles. Mr. Hale, I appreciate directness. I use it myself. But I'd ask you not to give me a final answer today. Let me leave the figures with you. Let you look them over. I've heard the figures, Gideon said. I don't need to look them over. The land isn't for sale. Something shifted in Vance's expression. Not anger, not yet. More like a door closing quietly somewhere behind his eyes. He looked around the room again, more deliberately this time, and Evelyn watched him take stock of everything. The books, the worn furniture, the lamp-black board stacked near the stairs waiting to go back up to the classroom, the general condition of a house that had been lived in hard and not luxuriously. You're a teacher, Vance said. Not a question. I teach, yes. Vance turned his cup. Evelyn had set cups on the table out of courtesy she was already regretting, and the gesture was thoughtful in a way that wasn't thoughtful at all. I've done a little reading about you, Mr. Hale. I hope you don't mind. Due diligence is part of the work. The air in the room changed. Gideon's face went very still. I don't mind, he said. You were a teacher in Pennsylvania, quite respected by some accounts. Vance's voice remained pleasant. Ellsworth County, I believe. Left under some difficulty, something to do with the school board, community funds. The accusations were false, Gideon said. His voice was level, but something had gone out of it. Some warmth that hadn't been abundant to begin with. Well, Vance said, accusations rarely come from nowhere, do they? He said it with the mild reasonableness of a man stating the obvious. I'm not here to judge old history, Mr. Hale, but I will tell you that the families in this settlement are going to hear about it if they haven't already. People have a right to know who's teaching their children. He spread his hands in a gesture of regret. That's just how it works. Evelyn stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. Mr. Vance? Her voice was even. He looked at her with the polite interest men like him extended to women when they felt like being gracious about it. You came here to buy land, she said. You've been told the land isn't for sale. Everything since then has been a threat. She held his gaze. I think that's about all the conversation we need. Vance looked at her for a moment, then at Gideon, and then he stood up, unhurried, deliberate, a man who left rooms on his own schedule. I'll leave the figures with you anyway, he said to Gideon, and nodded to his clerk, who set a folded paper on the edge of the table. Think it over, both of you. He looked at the shelves one more time. Nice books. He walked out. His clerk followed. Outside, the horses moved and the sound of them faded back up the canyon road. The kitchen was very quiet. Gideon stood with both hands flat on the table, looking at the folded paper Vance's clerk had left. He didn't touch it. He'll do it, he said. He'll go to the families. Probably, Evelyn said. Then they'll leave. The Tanners, the Adlers, all of them. His jaw was tight. Martha Adler already lost one home. She's not going to risk her children on a man with that kind of history following him. Maybe. Evelyn crossed to the table and picked up the paper and looked at the number on it. It was a substantial number. She set it back down. Or maybe the families think for themselves. People don't think for themselves when someone with money and a smooth voice tells them what to be afraid of. He said it with a flatness that came from experience, not cynicism. I know how this goes, Evelyn. I've watched it happen once before, up close. She didn't argue with that. She couldn't. She stood in the kitchen with the folded paper in front of her and the late afternoon shadow filling the canyon outside the window, and she thought. It came faster than she'd hoped. 2 days later, James Tanner pulled his children from the school. He came himself, which she respected, riding up to the house in the early morning before lessons were due to begin. He was a decent man, big and uncomfortable in the situation, and he had the look of someone who had made a decision he wasn't entirely at peace with. I'm sorry, he said, standing in the yard, turning his hat in his hands. I heard things, and I've got 5 children, Mrs. Hale. I can't... What did you hear? Evelyn asked. She kept her voice neutral. That your husband... Tanner stopped. That there was trouble in the East, with money, with people's trust. He glanced toward the house and then away. I don't know what's true and what isn't, but I've got to be careful. The accusations against him were false, she said. Not disputed. False. There was never a trial, never a hearing. One man made accusations, and a community that should have known better chose fear over evidence. Tanner looked at her, honestly considering. Then he shook his head slowly. I'm sorry, he said again. I truly am. He rode away with his children that morning. By afternoon, word came through Martha Adler that the Pembroke family, the ones who'd arrived without being invited the first morning, had also withdrawn. Gideon was upstairs when it happened. He was in the East Room, alone, sitting on one of the benches they'd built. Evelyn found him there when she went to tell him. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his head down, not reading, not doing anything. Just sitting in the room they'd built together in the house he'd lived in, alone for 12 years, with morning light coming through the south windows and empty spaces on 3 of the 4 benches. She sat down beside him. "Gideon, I know. Not everyone, I know." He lifted his head and looked at the front of the room, at the tin board with the alphabet still chalked on it, at the nail holes in the plaster. "I should have told you from the beginning that this was going to happen. I knew it was going to happen." He pressed the heel of his hand against his knee. "I let myself—" He stopped. "You let yourself hope," she said. He said nothing. "That's not a mistake," she said. "That's just what it costs sometimes." He turned and looked at her, and in his face she could see everything it had cost him. Not just in the last weeks, but in the 12 years before that, the slow weight of it. A man who had built himself a life out of stone and books and distance, because every time he'd tried to build something out of people, it had fallen apart. "I'm not leaving," she said, quiet and direct. "If that's what you're waiting to hear me say." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. And this time when he said it, it meant something different. She stood up and went to the tin board and picked up the chalk. "Thomas is still coming," she said, "and the Adler boys. And the little girl, Anna. Martha said she tried to lock herself in the bedroom when her mother suggested they might stop coming." A faint pause. "Apparently she bit someone." Something in Gideon's face shifted. Not a smile, but in the territory adjacent to one. "We still have 6 students," Evelyn said. She wrote the date on the board. "Class is in 40 minutes. He was quiet for another moment. Then she heard the bench creak as he stood. "The older Tanner boy," he said behind her. "William. He was just starting on his multiplication tables." "I know. If he stops now, he'll lose what he's learned." "I know that too." He turned around. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not braced, just standing there in the room. "So we have to make sure what he's already learned sticks well enough that he doesn't lose it. And when this blows over, when Vance moves on or is stopped, William Tanner can come back and he'll find that we're still here." Gideon looked at her. "You're very certain," he said. "No," she said. "I'm very determined. There's a difference." He held her gaze a beat longer. Then he gave a short nod, the way he agreed to things he wasn't sure about but was willing to try, and walked to the doorway to wait for the children to arrive. Vance made his next move 4 days after that. He held what he called a town meeting in Ridgeline at the church on a Thursday evening. Evelyn and Gideon heard about it from Doris Phelps, who sent word through the supply rider, "You ought to be there. He's going to use your absence if you're not." They rode into Ridgeline in the early evening with the canyon at their backs. Gideon hadn't been to a gathering like this in years. She could feel the particular quality of his silence on the ride in, the stillness that was different from his ordinary quiet. He held the reins loosely and looked at the road ahead and didn't speak. The church was full. She hadn't expected that. Every rancher and settler she'd seen in passing on her trips to town, and many faces she hadn't seen, all of them packed into benches that were better built than the ones she and Gideon had made, she noticed, though she didn't say so. Vance stood at the front of the room beside a hand-drawn map pinned to the wall, showing the canyon and the proposed rail route in clean black lines. He looked calm and well-prepared and entirely at ease, and when Evelyn and Gideon came through the door, she watched his eyes find them immediately and file the information away without changing expression. He spoke for 20 minutes about the railroad, about what it would bring, markets, mail, medicine, faster connections to the outside world, about what the settlement stood to gain. He was good at it, she had to admit. He didn't oversell. He kept his language practical and specific, talking about cattle prices and supply costs and the particular miseries of frontier isolation in ways that landed on people she could see visibly responding in the benches around her. And then he got to Gideon. "I want to be honest with you," Vance said. His tone shifted, not dramatic, just considered, the voice of a man wrestling reluctantly with an unpleasant truth. There is one property in the canyon route where the owner has declined to negotiate. Mr. Hale at the East Canyon claim. He paused. I don't say this to poison anyone's view of a neighbor. I say it because this community deserves to know what's happening on its land and who is shaping that. He talked about Pennsylvania for 4 minutes. He had details. Names of the school board members, the amount alleged to have gone missing, the language of the original complaint. All of it framed in the particular careful phrasing of a man who could later claim he'd said nothing unfair. When he finished, the room shifted. Evelyn could feel it, the change in the air when a crowd decides something. The small movements of people turning to look at Gideon and then quickly away. James Tanner was in the third row. He was looking at the floor. She put her hand on Gideon's arm, felt it locked rigid under her fingers. Then she stood up. The room went quiet. Vance looked at her with courteous, anticipatory patience. I have a question, she said. Her voice carried clearly in the packed space. Of the facts you just told us about my husband's past, how many of them come from a legal document? A verdict? A hearing? A court record of any kind? Vance smiled. I'm not making any legal claims, Mrs. Hale. That's not what I asked. She held his gaze. I asked how many of those facts come from any official record. Yes or no? A pause. The complaint was filed with the school board. A complaint filed, she said. Not a verdict reached. Not a hearing completed. A complaint, filed by one man, about which no authority ever made a final ruling because there was nothing to rule on. She looked out at the faces in the room. What Mr. Vance just spent 4 minutes telling you was that my husband, 12 years ago, was accused by someone who was angry at him. That's it. That is the entire story. And the reason it chased Gideon Hale 3,000 miles across this country is not because he did anything wrong. It's because when one person with a loud voice says something terrible about you, the people around you often find it easier to believe it than to ask whether it's true. She could feel Gideon very still beside her. This railroad wants your land, she said to the room. Not angry, steady. It wants the canyon, and it wants you to help it take what doesn't belong to it by being afraid of a man whose only crime was refusing to sell. That is what tonight is for. She paused. I'm asking you to think about that before you go home. She sat down. The silence in the room lasted long enough that she could hear the lamp wicks burning. Then Vance spoke again, smooth as water, redirecting toward logistics and timelines. And the moment shifted and people began talking in low voices to their neighbors. And Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead and breathed. Beside her, Gideon sat without moving. After a moment, she felt his arm, which had been rigid under her hand, gradually release. The tension running out of it degree by degree, like something finally, slowly, letting go. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Outside, the canyon dark waited for them, and the ride home was quiet, and the stars were thick above the canyon walls, and neither of them spoke until they were back in the yard with the horses put away and the house lit and clothes around them. They didn't move, Gideon said finally, standing in the kitchen with the lamp on the table between them. When you spoke, most of them didn't move. Most of them didn't, she agreed. That's not enough to stop Vance. No, she said. It's not enough yet. She set the kettle on the stove and looked at the shelves, his shelves, packed floor to ceiling with 12 years of accumulated knowledge. Somewhere in those books, she was already thinking, there might be something else, something legal, something structural, some leverage that money couldn't simply push out of the way. We need to look at land law, she said. He turned to look at her. Territorial settlement law, she said. Property rights, homestead rights, anything related to institutional use of frontier land. She pulled a chair to the nearest shelf and ran her finger along the spines until she found a thick volume bound in faded green cloth. You have 800 books in this house. I'd be very surprised if there isn't an answer in one of them. She set it on the table and sat down and opened it. After a moment, she heard him pull out a chair across from her. She heard him reach for a volume from the shelf nearest the table. The kettle began to heat. Outside, the canyon held its quiet, and the creek ran its course. And in the kitchen of the canyon house, 2 people opened old law books and started looking for a way through. They worked through 3 nights before they found it. Not 3 consecutive nights of steady progress. 3 nights of dead ends and wrong turns and volumes that looked promising from the spine and turned out to be useless inside. Plus 1 night where Gideon fell asleep in his chair at the table around 2 in the morning with his cheek on an open page, and Evelyn put a blanket over him and kept reading alone until the lamp ran low. The law books were dense and written for men who already knew the language, and more than once she had to stop and ask Gideon to translate a clause into something that made practical sense, and more than once he had to admit he wasn't certain what it meant either. But they kept at it. There wasn't a choice. The children still came in the mornings. 6 of them now, steady, which was both less than they'd had and more than Evelyn let herself take for granted. Anna, the 5-year-old, had graduated from letters to simple words and treated each new one like a personal victory she had earned through superior effort. The Adler boys worked at different speeds and occasionally argued about it in a way that disrupted the class, but also, Gideon had noted privately to Evelyn, suggested a level of genuine engagement he hadn't expected. Thomas Burr had quietly become something like a junior teacher's aide. He'd sit near the younger children and help them with their letters, while Gideon worked with the older ones, doing it with a gruff patience that surprised everyone, possibly including Thomas himself. On the second night of searching, Gideon found the clause. It was in a territorial supplement to the Homestead Act, published in 1874 by the Montana Territorial Legislature. A thin document he'd acquired from an estate sale years ago and shelved without reading carefully, because at the time he'd had no reason to care about territorial land law. The supplement addressed specifically the conditions under which settled land could resist eminent domain claims by commercial entities, including rail companies. Most of it was predictable and unhelpful, but tucked into Section 14, in language that had the slightly apologetic quality of something added late in the drafting process, was a clause about institutional use, land on which an active educational institution had been operating for a minimum of 1 year, and which could demonstrate continued community service through documented enrollment and family attestation, could apply to the Territorial Land Office for a protected homestead designation. Once that designation was granted, commercial entities, specifically including railroad companies, could not invoke eminent domain without approval from the Territorial Governor's Office directly. 1 year, Evelyn said. She was leaning over his shoulder reading it twice. We've been running the school for less than 3 months. Yes. Gideon set the supplement flat on the table and looked at it. But the clause says operating. It doesn't specify under current ownership. He paused. I ran a school in this room 6 years ago, for 11 months. She looked at him. There's no formal record, he said. I didn't register it with anyone. There was no reason to at the time. He pressed his palm flat against the page. But the families who were here then, some of them are still in the area. The Carver family moved on, but the Lindqvist homestead, the Reese family on the North Branch, they were here. Their children were in this room. Would they say so? Formally? A pause. I don't know. I haven't spoken to most of them since the school closed. He said it without inflection, but she heard what was inside it. 6 years of not reaching out, of the same careful distance that governed everything he did with people. Then we need to find out, she said. She sat down and found a fresh piece of paper and the pencil. Names, she said. Everyone you can remember. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man reaching for something he'd filed away a long time ago and wasn't certain he'd find. Then he started talking. She wrote. 8 names, 5 families, spread across the canyon and the surrounding settlement. People who had moved in and moved on, and some who had stayed. She had the supply rider take 4 letters the next morning, and she and Gideon rode out themselves to the 2 homesteads close enough to reach by horse. The Reese farm was 3 miles up the canyon's north branch, and Evelyn had never been there. Leonard Reese was a lean, quiet man of 60 who met them at his fence line and looked at Gideon for a long moment without speaking. Been a while, he said. It has, Gideon said. I'm sorry for not... Don't, Reese said, not unkindly. Come inside. Reese's wife, Clara, made coffee and set it on the table without asking, and then sat down with them like a woman who had every right to be part of whatever conversation was coming. Their daughter? She would be 19 now, Evelyn calculated, if she'd been in that first class at 13, was not there. Married and moved to Billings, Reese told them. But he remembered. He remembered the school clearly, The months his daughter had spent at the Canyon house learning to read past a primer, learning arithmetic past counting on fingers. He said it the way people describe things that mattered, carefully, like handling something fragile. "We heard about the railroad," he said, when Gideon explained what they needed. "Heard about the meeting in town, too." He looked at Evelyn. "Heard what you said." She held his gaze. "Will you sign a statement? Saying your daughter attended school at the Canyon house, the dates, the duration?" He looked at his wife. She looked back at him with an expression that seemed to cover a great deal of ground silently. "Yes," he said. "I'll sign." The Lindqvist homestead was harder. Eric Lindqvist had aged badly and was suspicious of everything, and his wife did the talking while he stood in the doorway of their barn with his arms crossed and watched. But his wife, Britta, remembered. She described the specific afternoon her son had come home and read aloud from a book they had in the house, a Swedish almanac they'd brought from home, and how Eric had sat there and said nothing because he was crying, which she reported with a matter-of-fact directness that made it more affecting than it would have been otherwise. "He was stubborn about school," she said, nodding at her husband. "Thought it was waste of time. Boys needed to work." She folded her hands on the table. Then our son read that Almanac and Eric didn't argue anymore. Evelyn looked at Eric Lindqvist in the barn doorway. He met her gaze and then looked away. "We'll sign," Britta said. By the end of the week, letters had come back from 2 of the 4 families she'd written to. Both said yes. One letter was barely legible, written by someone who had clearly struggled with it. And that illegibility, for some reason, hit Evelyn harder than anything else had in weeks. 3 families were still silent. 5 signatures might be enough, Gideon said, on the evening the second letter arrived. "Might," she said. "We need it to be unambiguous. Vance is going to contest anything we file. If there's a gap in the record, he'll put his lawyers in it." He turned the letter over in his hands. "The Fowler family moved to Great Falls. I heard that from Doris Phelps. There were 2 boys. The older one, Ned, was the best student I had that year." He paused. "I don't have an address for them. Doris might." "Doris knows everything." Evelyn was already reaching for paper. What she hadn't counted on was Martha Adler. Martha had kept her children in the school through the town meeting and after, and Evelyn had been grateful without making it a point of conversation, understanding that Martha's tenacity was her own business. But 3 days after they'd filed the preliminary paperwork with the land office, a step that required Gideon to ride into Ridgeline and stand at the land office counter, while the clerk looked at him with poorly concealed unease, Martha appeared at the Canyon house on a morning when the children were just finishing their lesson. She waited until the children had gone. Thomas Burr was the last to leave. He always was. And Evelyn walked him to the door and watched him head down the canyon road with his brothers, and when she turned back, Martha was at the kitchen table with Gideon, and the expression on Martha's face was the one Evelyn had come to associate with her having decided something. "You need the Fowler family," Martha said. Gideon looked up. "How did you know that?" "Because I remember that year. I was here. My husband was still alive, and we had a claim on the East Branch that we lost in the drought. But I was here. And I remember Ned Fowler. He was the one who came in knowing nothing and left reading whatever Hale put in front of him." She folded her hands on the table. "My husband's brother lives in Great Falls. I can write to him. He can find the Fowlers if they're there." Gideon was very still. "Martha," he said, "after everything Vance said at that meeting, why are you still—" "Because I was there when Hale taught my daughter to read," Martha said flatly. "Before the drought, before we lost the claim, before everything. She was 7 years old, and she learned to read in this house, and that's a fact Harlow Vance can't change with a story." She looked at Gideon directly. "I don't know what happened in Pennsylvania. I know what happened in this canyon." Gideon looked at the table. Something in his face was doing that complicated interior work she'd seen before. Too much at once. "Thank you," he said, quiet and direct. No extra words around it. "Write the letter yourself," Evelyn said to Martha. "Today, if possible." Martha was already pulling paper across the table. They heard from Vance again 6 days later. Not in person this time. Through the land office clerk, who sent a formal notice that Continental Rail had filed an objection to the homestead application on the grounds that the claimed period of educational service predated the current resident's tenancy and could not be attributed to their ownership claim. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was plain. Vance's lawyers had found the same gap she had, and they were going to stand in it. Gideon read the notice at the kitchen table that evening and set it down and looked at the wall. "He has a point," he said. "Technically. Not just technically." He turned the notice over. "The clause requires that the educational institution be operating under the property owner's direction. I owned the property during both periods, yes, but there's a 12-year gap, and Vance's lawyers are going to argue the continuity is broken. That the current school is a new institution, not a continuation of the original." Evelyn thought about that. "Is there a legal counter to that argument?" "Possibly. If the institution is defined by the property rather than by a continuous operating period." He stopped. "I'd need to look at the original language more carefully, and I'd need someone who actually knows law." She looked at him. "Do we know anyone who knows law?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a man in Billings, Silas Ward. He was a practicing attorney in Ohio before he came west. He's half retired now, runs a small land practice out of his house." A pause. "I knew him slightly years ago. I'm not certain he'd—" "Write to him tonight," she said. "He might say no." "He might?" she said. "Write the letter tonight." He wrote it that night, and she sat across from him and read it when he was done. A careful, precise letter that laid out the situation in plain terms and asked for Ward's assessment of whether the continuity argument had legal merit, and if so, whether it could be countered. He didn't ask for help. He asked for an honest opinion. She thought that was the right call and said so. Ward's response came back in 9 days. In the meantime, the world moved. James Tanner came back. He came on a Tuesday morning without his children, riding alone up the canyon road. Evelyn saw him from the kitchen window and went to the door. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who had rehearsed something and was finding it harder to say than he'd expected. "I want to talk to Hale," he said. "He's in the east room with the children. Come in." He came in and stood in the front room among the books and waited. When the morning's lesson was over and the children had filed out, Gideon came downstairs and found Tanner in the front room. They looked at each other without speaking for a moment. "I owe you an apology," Tanner said. Gideon shook his head slightly. "You were protecting your children." "I was scared," Tanner said. "That's not the same as protecting them." He turned his hat over once in his hands. "I talked to Leonard Reese. He told me what you're trying to do with the land office, and he told me he signed a statement." He paused. "I was there too. 3 of my kids came to that first school 6 years back. My oldest, William, he was 4. Too young for much, but I remember bringing him." He looked at Gideon steadily. "I should have signed without waiting for Reese to push me." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "It's not too late to sign." "I know, that's why I came." He stayed for an hour. When he left, he had signed a statement and shaken Gideon's hand, and before he mounted up, he turned back from his horse and said, "William wants to come back. He's been miserable at home." "Monday morning," Gideon said. "Tell him Monday morning." Tanner nodded once and rode away. Ward's letter arrived 2 days later. It was 3 pages long and dense with legal reasoning that Evelyn read twice before she was confident she understood it. The short version was this. The continuity argument was legally vulnerable, but there was a counter. If they could demonstrate that the property had been maintained with educational intent throughout the intervening 12 years, books cataloged and preserved for teaching purposes, the physical infrastructure of the classroom kept in place, then the institution could be argued to have existed in a state of suspension rather than termination, not operating, but not dissolved. The books, the physical classroom, the organized cataloging system, all of it became evidence, if it could be attested to by witnesses who had visited the property during those years. Evelyn looked up from the letter. "People who visited during those 12 years, she said. "Who came here?" Gideon thought about it. "Cutter," he said. "The supply driver. He's come twice a year for the last 10 years. Cutter saw the books, the room. He complained about the books, Gideon said with a dryness that surprised her. Every time he delivered a crate of them, he had something to say about it. Good, she said. Complaining means he noticed. She was already reaching for paper. Who else? Reverend Marsh, he's come through on his circuit every 6 months. A pause. Doris Phelps, twice. She brought supplies out when the road was bad and I couldn't get to town. Doris will sign, Evelyn said with certainty. She might, he agreed. She had 4 more letters written before the lamp went low. Gideon took over the one to Reverend Marsh because he knew the man's particular formalities better than she did, and she found that small thing, the way he sat down and took the pen from her without being asked, adjusting the approach to fit the recipient, she found it quietly significant. A month ago, he would not have done that. He would have let her write the wrong letter rather than insert himself. He was still not easy to live with. He still went silent for hours in ways that could feel like walls going up when they were actually just the way he thought. He still overcooked things and set them on the table with that daring expression. He still flinched, sometimes, at the wrong word or the wrong tone, a reflex she'd stopped trying to talk him out of, and had started simply working around with patience. But he was present now in a way he hadn't been when she arrived. The difference between a man who has decided to endure his life and a man who has decided, tentatively and without certainty, to live it. The Fowler letter arrived from Great Falls on a Wednesday, 8 days after Martha had written. Ned Fowler was 21 years old and working at a livery, and he had written back in clear, steady handwriting that suggested he remembered every lesson, a handwriting that had clearly been practiced and maintained. The letter said he remembered the school in the canyon. He remembered Hale. He would sign anything they needed and could be in Ridgeline in a week if they required him to make a statement in person. Gideon read the letter at the table. He read it once, and then he set it down flat and put both hands on the table beside it and looked at his hands. Evelyn was at the stove. She let the silence run. "He writes well," Gideon said. His voice was careful with the words. "He does," she said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She turned back to the stove and listened to the canyon outside, the creek, and the wind. And she let Gideon have the moment without filling it, which was the best thing she knew how to give him. They submitted the full application to the land office on a Thursday, 12 days before Vance's lawyers had indicated they would file their formal eminent domain claim. The application included 11 signed statements, the original land deed, Ward's 3-page legal brief arguing continuous institutional intent, a catalog of the library demonstrating its educational organization, and a physical description of the classroom space signed by Gideon, Evelyn, and 3 witnesses who had seen it during the intervening years. Evelyn stood at the land office counter and watched the clerk, the same one who had looked at Gideon with poorly concealed unease. "Take the folder and open it, and look at the first page, and then look at her." "This is a substantial filing," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at it again, turned to the second page, then the third. She could see him reading, actually reading, which she hadn't expected. "I'll need to send a copy to the territorial office in Helena," he said. "We know. That's in the cover letter." He looked at her one more time, and then he stamped the intake receipt and handed it across the counter. She walked outside into the ridgeline street where Gideon was waiting with the horses. The afternoon sun was long and low and turned the dust golden, and the canyon walls beyond the town's edge burned red in the late light. She handed him the receipt. He looked at it. The stamp, the date, the reference number. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we wait," he agreed. She took the reins of her horse and looked at him across the animals. This man she had married in an 11-minute ceremony with no witnesses in a yard at the far end of a canyon that had swallowed 3 women before her. He was looking at the receipt still, the scar along his jaw in sharp relief in the angled light, his expression doing that complicated thing she'd spent months learning to read. "Whatever happens," she said, "we did it right." He looked up from the receipt, met her eyes. "Yes," he said. Just that. But the way he said it carried everything that came before it. The 4 days of bench building, the 12 years of books, the 6-year-old girl with all her letters, Thomas Burr writing his name until it held, the night they sat together over law books while the kettle heated and the creek ran outside, all of it. She put her foot in the stirrup and got on her horse. They rode home through the canyon in the last of the light, and the walls rose on either side of them, and the creek ran silver ahead, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said or built or signed or fought for. And sometimes silence between 2 people is not emptiness, but the opposite. Something full enough that words would only make it less. The waiting was its own kind of punishment. 14 days between filing the application and the land office's preliminary response. 14 days in which the school kept running and the canyon kept its rhythms, and Evelyn kept herself occupied with the particular discipline of not thinking too far ahead. She had learned that about herself over the course of this strange year. She was not a woman who handled uncertainty well by accepting it. She handled it by working. So she worked. She planted the fall garden in rows that were straighter than they needed to be. She repaired the lean-to roof with Gideon over 2 cold mornings, both of them on ladders with nails in their teeth, and neither of them talking much. She read to the younger students from a battered copy of Aesop's Fables she'd found in the 3rd shelf from the bottom on the east wall, and she noticed that even the older children, Thomas Burr included from his permanent spot at the back, went very still and listening when she read aloud, and she thought about what it meant to be hungry for stories and not know it until someone put one in front of you. Gideon taught through the 14 days with the same careful consistency he'd maintained since the first morning, but she could see the waiting in him the way she'd learned to see everything in him, not on the surface but underneath it, in the particular quality of his silences at night, the way he'd stop sometimes in the middle of the front room and look at the shelves as though taking inventory of something. On the 9th day, he said, without preamble, at supper, "If the application is rejected, we can appeal to the territorial office directly." Ward said the legal argument is sound enough to survive a first rejection. "I know," she said. "It would take longer. Another month, possibly more. Vance's people would file their claim in the meantime, and we'd be fighting on 2 fronts. I know that too." He looked at his plate. "I'm just saying there are options." "Gideon," she set down her fork. "I know. You've thought it through and there are options and we will use them if we need to. I know all of that." She looked at him across the table. "What you're actually asking is whether I'll stay for it." He met her eyes. Didn't say anything. "Yes," she said, simply. "I'll stay for it." He looked back at his plate, ate a bite of something she'd made that was not her best work, didn't comment on it. "All right," he said. The preliminary response came on a Thursday morning, brought out from Ridgeline by the supply rider, who handed the envelope to Evelyn with the careful expression of someone aware they are delivering something consequential. She carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the bottom of the stairs and called Gideon's name. He came down without his book for once, which told her he'd been waiting for it too. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages from the Ridgeline Land Office, under the heading of the Montana Territorial Land Registry. She read the first paragraph once, then again. "They've accepted the institutional continuity argument," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Ward's brief, the argument about suspension rather than termination, they accepted it. She looked at the second page. "They're requesting a supplemental review from the Helena office before issuing the formal designation, but the preliminary ruling says they say the application demonstrates sufficient educational service to qualify for protected homestead consideration." She looked up. Gideon was standing at the kitchen doorway with both hands pressed flat against the door frame on either side, like a man bracing himself. His face was doing something she hadn't seen from it before. Not the complicated, tangled expression, not the braced against judgment look. Something that was simply trying to hold its shape against something larger pressing against it from the inside. "It's not final," he said. His voice was careful. "No, not until Helena confirms. Vance will contest the supplemental review. His lawyers—" "I know." She set the letter on the table. "But we're ahead of him now. We filed first and the initial ruling went our way, and that matters." She looked at him steadily. "This is good news, Gideon. You're allowed to know it's good news." He looked at the letter on the table. Then he crossed the kitchen and picked it up and read it himself, slowly, from the beginning. She watched his eyes move across the lines, watched his jaw, which had been set for 2 weeks solid, ease by degrees. He set the letter down. "I need to tell the Reeses," he said, "and Martha, and Tanner." "Yes," she said. "I should go myself." "Yes," she said again. "You should." He looked at her. That open, unguarded look that still came and went quickly, but came more often now than it had in August. Then he took the letter and folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and went to saddle the horse. She watched him ride out of the canyon yard and stood in the kitchen for a while in the quiet, And then she sat down at the table and let herself feel the thing she'd been holding at arm's length for 2 weeks, the shaky, impure relief of a possibility not yet won, but no longer impossible. It wasn't triumphant. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on ground that had stopped shifting quite so violently beneath your feet, and knowing you still had a long walk ahead, but at least now you could walk it without your legs giving way. She made a cup of chicory and sat with it until it went cold. Then she went upstairs to prepare tomorrow's lesson. Vance made one more move. She had expected it, and it came 9 days after the preliminary ruling, in the form of a letter sent not to the land office, but directly to the Canyon House, addressed to Gideon specifically, in Continental Rail's formal letterhead. It was a legal document, dense and technically phrased, which cited 3 precedents arguing that the institutional continuity interpretation was without foundation in established territorial law and would not survive appellate review. It also contained, in the final paragraph, what amounted to a last offer, a sum significantly higher than the original figure, described as a gesture of goodwill, available for 30 days. Gideon read it at the table in the evening. He read it without expression, the way he read things he was making himself be dispassionate about. "He's scared," Evelyn said. Gideon looked up. "He sent this here instead of through the land office. He went around the official process to come directly to you." She nodded at the letter. "That's not how a man who's confident in his legal position behaves. That's how a man behaves when he's been told his position is weaker than he thought." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Or it's how a man behaves when he's certain enough of winning that he wants to give us one more chance to take the money and save everyone the trouble." "Maybe," she said. "Which do you think it is?" He looked at the letter again. The number in the final paragraph was significant, more than the land was worth on any market she could calculate, which was either generosity or desperation, and generosity had not been Harlow Vance's defining characteristic in any interaction she'd witnessed. "Desperation," Gideon said. "That's what I think, too." He folded the letter. "Then we don't respond." "We don't respond," she agreed. He put the letter in the stove. The formal designation came from the Helena office on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the preliminary ruling. It arrived as 2 documents, a certificate of educational homestead designation for the Canyon property, and a separate formal notice to Continental Rail that their eminent domain claim had been denied on grounds of protected educational use, with a note that any future claim on the property would require approval from the territorial governor's office, a process that, as Ward had predicted, no railroad company had ever successfully navigated in Montana territory. Evelyn read both documents at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window and the sound of the creek outside and the distant voices of children arriving early for class drifting down from the yard. She read them carefully, twice, in the methodical way she read legal language. Then she stacked them neatly and set them beside the lamp. She heard Gideon on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and saw the documents on the table and stopped. She looked up at him. "It's done," she said. He came to the table and picked up the certificate, his name on it, the property description, the date, the territorial seal at the bottom, red wax, official and final in the way that only a piece of paper with a government seal can be final. Not because paper is strong, but because enough people have agreed to treat it as though it is. He set it down. He sat in the chair across from her and he put his face in his hands. She didn't say anything. She let him have it. Whatever it was, the 12 years, and the Pennsylvania schoolroom, and the man who had accused him, and the people who hadn't stood up, and the long quiet canyon exile, and the books he'd collected like a man building a wall to live behind, and the benches they'd built in 4 days of cold mornings, and the children who had come, and then some who had left, and then some who had come back, and Ned Fowler writing in steady, clear handwriting from Great Falls, and all of it, the whole accumulated weight of a decade of waiting for something to mean something again. She let him have it. After a while, he lifted his face. His eyes were red at the edges, and he looked worn through, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was not a handsome man in any conventional arrangement of the word, but that there was something in his face right now that was more than handsome, something true, the specific look of a person who has been stripped all the way down to what they actually are. "Class starts in 20 minutes, he said. His voice was rough. "I know," she said. He stood up. He went to the basin and washed his face. He came back to the table and picked up the documents and looked at her. "Where should these go?" he said. She thought about it. "The East Room," she said. "On the wall, above the board." Something moved through his face. "Yes," he said. "All right." He went upstairs. She heard him in the East Room, one nail, two, and then his footsteps and the children's voices below arriving in the yard, and she stood up and started the morning fire and listened to the house fill with sound the way a dry canyon fills when the rain finally comes. Suddenly, completely, as though it had always been capable of this and was only waiting for the conditions to be right. The rest of that autumn was not a fairy story. She wanted to be honest about that, at least in the part of herself where she kept the true accounting of things. The school had 14 students by October and 22 by November, which sounds like triumph, and was also an enormous amount of work, more than 2 people could manage without strain. Evelyn took the younger children in the mornings, while Gideon worked with the older ones, and they traded in the afternoons, and by the end of most days, she was tired in a way that went past the body into something deeper. There were days she snapped at Gideon over something small, and he went silent in the specific way that still, even now, made her feel like she'd broken something. And she'd have to find him later and say something direct and ungraceful about it. And he'd say something equally ungraceful back, and they'd arrive at a kind of rough equilibrium that was not smooth or romantic, but was theirs. He was still difficult. She had no illusions about that. He still moved through the world with a wariness that would probably never fully leave him. A man who had learned at considerable cost what happens when you trust easily. Some evenings he was somewhere else entirely, behind his walls, and she'd learned to leave him there until he came back on his own. Some mornings he'd wake with the Pennsylvania thing sitting on him like weather, and she'd see it in his eyes at breakfast, and she'd just make the chicory and not ask and wait for it to pass, which it always did, because that's what time does with old pain when you don't keep feeding it. But he laughed now, occasionally. Not often, and usually when he didn't intend to. Something a child said, or something she said that caught him wrong, or once, memorably, when the mule escaped from the lean-to and wandered into the East Room during an afternoon lesson and stood there among the benches with an expression of complete moral certainty, while 11 children screamed and Gideon tried to reason with it. She'd heard him laughing from downstairs and come up to find him leaning against the doorframe with his hand over his face while the chaos sorted itself out, and the laugh was rusty and imperfect and real, and she stored it away with the other things she kept. Thomas Burr stopped coming to class in October. Not because of anything gone wrong, but because he'd run out of things they could teach him that he couldn't teach himself. And she told him so plainly and suggested he write to Warden Billings about reading law, which Thomas received with the particular expression of someone being handed something they'd thought was out of reach. He came back to the school every few weeks after that to sit in with the younger children, not as a student, but as himself. A tall, raw-boned young man who'd grown up thinking the written world wasn't for him, and was still in the process of understanding that it was. James Tanner's son William came back in October and sat down at his bench like he'd never left. And he didn't apologize, and nobody asked him to. His multiplication tables were exactly where Gideon had expected them to be. A little rusty, quickly recovered. Within 2 weeks, he was ahead of where he'd stopped. Anna, the 5-year-old who had been at her wits' end at her mother's wits' end, turned 6 in November and marked the occasion by reading an entire page of David Copperfield aloud to the class. Not perfectly. She stumbled on several words and mispronounced 2, and stopped twice to push her hair out of her face with the impatience of someone who found interruptions annoying. But she read it, the whole page, to the end. Gideon said nothing when she finished. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she, at 6 years old, probably couldn't fully read, and then he said, "Again, from the beginning. This time, watch the punctuation." Anna sighed heavily and started again. Evelyn, in the back of the room with the younger children, looked at the wall above the tin board where the Certificate of Educational Homestead designation hung in a frame Gideon had made from spare timber. Not elegant, the joints slightly uneven, but solid and level and built to last. She looked at it for a moment and then back at Anna, who was reading again with her whole body, leaning forward, fingers tracking the lines. Doris Phelps came out to the canyon in early December, the first time she'd made the ride in years. She stood in the East Room doorway during the afternoon lesson and watched for a while without saying anything. Evelyn found her there when she came up from the kitchen, and they stood together in the doorway and watched Gideon at the front of the room, explaining long division to a row of 9-year-olds with the focused, patient precision she'd seen him apply to everything he cared about. "I owe you an apology," Doris said quietly. "I told a lot of people in town that Vance probably had a point about the past." "I know," Evelyn said. "I shouldn't have." "No," Evelyn agreed. "You shouldn't have." Doris was quiet for a moment. "He's good at it," she said, watching Gideon. "He was always good at it. I'd forgotten." "He forgot too," Evelyn said. "For a while." Doris looked at her. "And you reminded him." Evelyn thought about how to answer that. She thought about the morning she'd found him in this room before the children came, standing at the window with the Pennsylvania thing sitting on him. She thought about saying we start from where we are and meaning it for both of them. She thought about the list she'd made on the second morning: fence, garden, shutter, water trough, and how making the list had been, in its own small way, the same gesture as everything that came after. Here is the work. Here is where we start. Nothing is impossible if you're willing to begin. He didn't need reminding, she said. He needed someone to stay long enough that he could remember himself. Doris looked at her another moment. Then she nodded once, the way a woman nods when something has confirmed what she thought but wasn't sure of. In the room, a 9-year-old girl got her first long division problem right and looked up at Gideon with an expression of profound personal vindication. And Gideon looked back at her and said, with a dryness that did not conceal what was underneath it, "Don't look so surprised. You've been capable of that for 2 weeks. You just didn't believe it yet." The girl beamed. The boy beside her asked if he could try one. Evelyn turned away from the doorway and went back downstairs to start supper. And the creek ran outside, and the canyon held the house and the school and everyone inside it in its red stone walls. And the afternoon light came through the windows, long and gold, and rested on the shelves of books. 800 or 1,000, never precisely counted, that had been waiting here for 12 years for exactly this. Not for a railroad, not for money, not for the particular kind of progress that measures everything in terms of what it costs and what it returns. For this, a room full of children learning to read, a man rediscovering what he was made of, a woman who had stepped off a wagon into a canyon that had scared away 3 others and decided, without drama and without certainty, that she would stay and see what could be built. There's a thing people say about the frontier, that it was a place where only the strong survived. And maybe that was true in some ways. But Evelyn Mercer, looking back on that year from the vantage of many years later, would have told you that what she learned in that canyon was something different, that the ones who built something lasting were not always the strongest, not always the loudest or the most confident or the best equipped. They were the ones who stayed, who showed up the next morning after the hard night, who built benches when there were no benches, and opened doors when the doors had been closed for years, and made lists of what needed doing and started at the top of the list without waiting to feel ready. Who looked at a broken man and saw not the damage but the architecture beneath it, what had been there before the damage, and what was still there, waiting to be used. Gideon Hale taught school in that canyon for 20 more years. The building expanded twice. The library grew to over 2,000 volumes. Students came from 3 counties, and some of them went east to universities, and some stayed and built their own lives in the valley. And all of them carried something out of that east room with them. Not just the reading and the arithmetic, but the particular quality of attention Gideon gave to everyone who sat in front of him. The belief, demonstrated rather than stated, that knowing things mattered, that you were worth the trouble of teaching. And in all that time, the Certificate of Educational Homestead designation hung on the wall above the tin board in its slightly uneven timber frame, and no railroad ever came through that canyon. Not because railroads aren't powerful. They are. Not because money doesn't win. It often does. But because 2 people had stayed in a canyon when they could have run and built something that turned out to be harder to move than a rail company had calculated, and because 11 people had signed their names to a piece of paper saying, "This happened here, this mattered, this is